All right, and then we'll get anyone else who comes in a few minutes late in a moment. So first off, thank you all for coming. And hopefully this will be part 1 of 3. So kind of we'll talk about flipped classroom. You'll come up with at least something to try out for the first month or so, and then meet again later to kind of talk about how it went, to expand it further, and then meet like a third time after classes or in the fall maybe, depending. And one of the big things about that I do teaching is active learning. So my workshop is also active. So you're not just going to be sitting here listening or something. So that sort of defeats the whole purpose, right? So hopefully you're not too worn out from scheduling this morning. All right, so I'm going to give you 30 seconds to think about this on your own. So if you could change only one thing about your students, what would it be? You can only pick one. All right, what about 2 volunteers to share what they came up with? You want to share? What'd you say?
We talked about how we thought they should prepare more for class.
Mm-hmm.
And we liked if they had more self-confidence, they would be more effective.
Yeah, definitely. Did anyone choose E? Probably not. So I think the whole purpose of flipped classroom and all this stuff would be to help students with all of those things. If you remind me, we'll come back to that at the end. But if you're more prepared, you speak up more, you're more confident, they kind of, all those things to me go together. So that's kind of the point. All right, but before you can really get into flipping your classroom, you have to have great learning objectives. Because if you don't know what you want your students to know, how are you going to decide what you want them to know at home and what you want them to get from class, right? So that'd be like step 1, I think. So we'll start with that. And so how to create good learning objectives, that's what we'll spend probably 10 or 15 minutes on. And basically, a learning objective, sorry, I'm sure some of you already know this, but basically you complete the sentence, at the end of this class, students will be able to blank. And what you'll see is some people write learning objectives that aren't very good. They're too broad, they're too narrow, students don't know what they mean. So for it to be useful, you need to be able to measure it. So like you could write a test question based on what you just wrote pretty easily, or assign an assignment, like a paper or something. The students have to be able to understand it. So if you throw in like 10 huge words into your learning objective, they're not gonna know what you're talking about. Or if it's 3 paragraphs long, they don't know what you mean. And then an appropriate level. So for example, like an at-home objective, I don't think you could tell them to describe all the steps in photosynthesis, right? That would be a little too high level for, you know, a first-year student to just go home and learn that by themselves, right? All right, so which of these do you think is the best? So once again, we'll do 30 seconds on your own, and then give you some time to talk about it. Why don't you talk to your neighbor there, talk about each one of those and say whether you think it's good or bad, or in between, and it could be better, maybe. We'll start with A there, and then go to B and C and D.
Yeah.
What do y'all think about A? Is A good?
No, broad,
Too broad. And that's actually what you see from a lot of people. They'll put that as an objective. And you're like, what? Okay, I don't know where are you to start? B, like you said, very clear, very easy to write a question for. And that one's really good. What about C? It's way too broad, right? Translation's like 3 chapters in a textbook. So what part do they need to know? What about D?
I just don't like some genes. I want it to be more specific.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. So it could be more specific. For me, that's a pretty good objective because the answer is they're used for similar things. for that one. What about E?
I liked it.
Yeah, and so this is the one, this is the hardest thing because, you know, we're experts in what we're teaching, right? And so you want to get as much in your objectives as you can. And so like, I'll find myself writing something like this, and then you use it for a semester, and every student asks you, what? Like, what?
There could be 6 good objectives within all.
Yes, yeah. So for one like that, just split it up so that they can take it a piece at a time. You know, chromosomes are in the middle of metaphase, separate anaphase. That could be the answer. And then if you wrote it separately about the nuclear membrane, you could say it disintegrates here, reforms here. But they'll just give up if they see something like that. Of course, everyone's seen these before. Like to include it because it actually has all the different verbs. So whenever I'm teaching a new class, I always have this out when I'm looking through the chapters and deciding what the objectives are for that chapter. And you've got kind of the easier ones down at the bottom. So list, describe, find, define. And then for each chapter, at least try to get 1 or 2 of those higher ones up there. So maybe it's construct an experiment to test this, or compare and contrast this tissue with this tissue. And I am going to give you all a handout with all these verbs on there. I find it's really helps with brainstorming if you actually have your list of verbs in front of you. If you notice, does anyone see understand up there anywhere? I won't make you look too long. Understand is not generally considered a taxonomy word. It's too broad. Like, what does understand mean? So instead, you want to explain or discuss or describe. Great. All right, so I'm going to give you 4 minutes on your own. I've got a little handout for you. So it's got all the verbs on there. And I want you to come up with 2 learning objectives for one of the classes you're teaching. And then we'll have some time to compare and see if your neighbors think that one makes any sense at all. So after you've got your objectives, kind of ready to move on a little bit. And everybody's heard about active learning, sort of if a student's actually doing something in class or at home, they're probably going to learn it better than just sitting there. And so one of the things I always show my students is this graph from a science paper, 2011. So it was done in Boulder in a science class, like I think a sophomore level class. And they split them all up. And since they have so many students, you know, they can have 300 students taking a class traditional lecture. The very highly rated professor gets great reviews from all the students. And then they take the other 300 and put them in a class taught by grad students actively. So they'll do activities in class and do clicker questions, yada, yada. And then they give them pre-test, post-test, see what kind of gains they make. And you could see basically how many points better they did. And the black bars were the active learning class, and the gray bars were the lecture. And these were mostly sort of higher level thinking questions, like are they getting the main concepts? And you could see like a giant difference, which was pretty surprising because this professor who just lectures, you know, he thinks he's great, his students think he's great, but they weren't actually learning the core concepts very well. And there's been lots and lots of papers published on that in all different fields of study. So one of the things people always kind of say when you talk about active learning is, how do you have the time, right? You could list someone, you could list the components of the cell and their functions in about 3 minutes. But maybe students aren't learning it. If you want to do something active with it, like an activity, that's going to take 20 minutes. So how do you kind of have time for it without losing out on everything else? Any ideas? What?
I said that's where I struggle.
Yeah. Well, I think the answer is to do the flipped model, at least partially, because you can have the students learn definitions, do easier stuff before class, and take that 15 minutes where you're going to be talking about that stuff, have them learn at home, and then you have an extra 15 minutes to do an activity for something harder. Whereas sort of the traditional is more like you do the easy stuff in class, and then they have to go to compare and contrast and analyze at home. So what's harder for a student, right? Learn some definitions at home and work with a group to analyze, compare, and contrast with help from a teacher, or have to do it all on their own at home. So at least to me, that's like kind of the main reason to try out at least some aspects of the flip model. All right, so of course everyone always hears the flipped classroom, and it doesn't actually mean one thing. It can mean all kinds of different stuff. So all it really means is students have to do something before they come to class. So if you're already having them read the chapter, you're kind of doing the flipped model already. But maybe that's not the most effective way, but it's something, right? So they could read the chapter. Other flipped classroom things people have done is record their lectures, have students watch them beforehand. One of the things I did at Front Range and Aurora is make soft chalks, which I'll show you what those are in a second. They're like web pages. And then whatever you're doing outside, this gives you extra time to do active learning in the classroom. And that doesn't mean you have to just do active learning the whole time. Maybe you want to do a 30-minute lecture and then do some activities. But at least you're doing something, right? And you can kind of start small, and if it works well for you, then you can expand it from there. All right, so what is a soft chalk? It's basically an interactive web page that you make. It's a program that's sold. You don't have to know HTML or anything. I don't. But you type in there, you can put activities, you can put videos, sorting activities, all kinds of stuff in there. And it is graded, so you can make sure students are actually learning something from it. And unfortunately, you'd have to make them. And it's $500 for a year for a subscription. But that could be used from, 10 faculty members could use it. So what does one of them look like? This would probably be something like a grant, like write a grant, get some release time to do it. Because it took us at Front Range about 8 hours per chapter to do it, probably. So there's like 5 of us that were working on it. Jonathan, why is this computer so slow? Oh no. All right, so before class, the students would be, this is actually linked to D2L, so they could just click on it and this would come up. This is our transcription translation chapter. So they'd start at the beginning, but let's say they were going back because they didn't remember what transcription was. So you've got, some text, very basic. A lot of our textbooks they seem very unbasic. It's like paragraphs after paragraphs. So the advantage of this is you as a teacher can write down what you think the main points are that you want them to know before they come. Then you can put in any images you want, embed videos for them to watch from YouTube, or you could create your own. And then I think the biggest strength of this is you can make your own little quiz questions. This is really slow. So for example, this is one of those multi-select, multiple choice questions. And if they got it right, it'll tell them they're right. If they get it wrong, it'll tell them they're wrong. And you can even there if they get it wrong. So kind of like, it's almost like asking them questions and giving them feedback while they're at home. So it's a pretty cool new thing. It's called a soft chalk. And at the end of, so we flipped half of the Bio 111 sections using soft chalks in class activities only. We didn't lecture at all. And then we surveyed our students at the end to see what they thought was most helpful. Notice the book didn't get a very high rating. No one ever likes textbooks. The soft chalks got the highest. So like 5 being, extremely helpful. And that was better than the clicker questions, better than the group assignments in class. Connect is like a publisher provided questions and activities. They didn't like those very much. Mostly, I think, because they weren't very aligned always to the chapters or our objectives. So any pros and cons? I guess we don't have any room to write them, but what are some pros, do you think, to doing something like this?
More student interaction and involvement in class.
Yeah, definitely more interaction in class.
Fun would be, work and get it all done.
You mean like for the teacher?
Yeah.
Definitely. What else?
Not all students are going to be prepared no matter what you do.
This is very true. Certainly know that. And that's one thing that we did to try to help with that is we gave them group bonus point quizzes, like right when they came in, to try to get a little bit of that like social, like you didn't prepare, now you can't help us with this quiz, to embarrass them a little bit. But then it's just bonus points, so it's not like too upsetting. I'm not sure how well that helped. I can say when we were using the soft chalk, most of the time we could get 20 out of 22 or 21 students actually doing them after a week or two. And I think it's mostly because they did find it really helpful, and it usually take them half an hour. So it wasn't like telling them to read a chapter in a textbook, which takes, it takes some students hours to do that.
I think a lot of the appeal is because it's technology-based.
That could be part of it, so like they could do it on their phone, their iPad. But, I don't think that's just if you recorded a 20-minute lecture for them to watch, questions to answer. That's certainly an easier way to do it that I think would be helpful too, right? It doesn't have to be that fancy. Well, it could be 10 minutes, Oh, and one thing, we didn't put any videos longer than like 3 minutes in there, because it's kind of long, right? So what I think kind of the keys to actually having it be successful is that they have clear objectives provided to them, so they know what they're trying to learn at home, not just watch this and know it for class. And some kind of assessments, like Barbara's talking about. How do you make them do it? So, you can maybe have them turn in questions at the beginning of class. You give them a little quiz when they come in. It could be a D2L quiz before they come in. Actually trying or learning the material. And then to make whatever activities you're doing in class, focus on those higher level critical thinking objectives. Because if you tell them to define a bunch of words at home, and then they come into class and you just define them again, what's the point? Like it's going to be really obvious to them that it's just the same thing. Why should they do it first if you're going to do it again? And I think the real challenging thing is to decide what's easy enough for them at home, right? I don't really have an answer to that. That's just trial and error, right? try this objective. If no one gets it right for a semester, maybe it's too hard. You need to make it easier or choose some easier ones. Oh, and one thing I did want to point out is when they come into class, I think it's really important to always give them a chance to ask any questions they had on what you told them to do at home. Just so they don't feel like they never get a chance to ask you if they're right about something. So before the assessment part, I think that's, take 5 minutes, review it, but only if they ask you a question. Because if you just go up there and tell them all the answers from what they did at home, then they're not going to really have any incentive to actually do it at home. Right. So kind of mentioned that before. We flipped half the Bio 111 sections. That's 16 sections, 8 sections, did the soft chalks at home. We did activities for the whole class period, which our classes were pretty long. So we had like 4 hours a week of activities. So group work, pair work, all kinds of stuff, models. And then we did a common final exam for all the sections. And you could see that last bar at the end. Our flip sections got 10% higher on the final. All the students had the same study guide. All the instructors had the same objectives to teach from for both those sections. And that was pretty good. The one thing that we didn't improve, which we hoped to, was retention. So we had about the same drop withdrawal rate in the flipped and the non-flipped. But then again, it was the first 2 semesters we tried it, so maybe as we got better at it, I don't know. One of the surprising results is we looked a few semesters later at how the students did in their next class. Compared like the students in the flip section versus the student in the not flipped. How did they do after? Because if you ask people, like nursing people, how prepared are your students? Or, the Bio 201, they're not all that prepared usually. And so we had, for Bio 112, 68 versus 50 for the pass rate in the next class. And then 204, 78 versus 64. So a really dramatic improvement in their next class. So maybe they've actually learned it better, or they learned study skills. Hard to know exactly, why those numbers are different. All right, so doing good on time. So I put in the workshop description that you'd actually, come away with something useful, hopefully. So what I'd like you to do is take, how much time do I write down here? Take 10 minutes and decide on a topic that you're going to teach in the next month or 2. Choose a couple objectives and say, I'm going to make my students learn these at home before they come. This doesn't have to be the whole class, right? Not an hour, but 15 minutes of class that you can say, it's easy enough, they can do that at home. Decide how you want them to learn it. So is it going to be, here's these questions, here's your book, make sure you know this. Is it going to be, I'm going to post a 5 or 10 minute video about it? Are you going to make a soft chalk? Probably not going to do that. But come up with your assessment, and then at the end, some ideas for activities you could do with your extra 15 minutes. It's kind of related, maybe taking it a step farther for so 10 minutes, and I'll walk around and help you all go through that. And then we'll give you 5 minutes in groups to kind of share what you come up with. I've got another one. All right. So we've got just a few moments left. So kind of some reflection barriers. First of all, how well do you think students like this? Do you think they like this right away? They hate it. So main kind of thing I would say is, if you're going to try it out, work on it, don't expect them to like it right away. Don't get discouraged if they're grumpy about it. We surveyed our students. 85% of them at the beginning of the class said, this sounds terrible, I don't want to do this, I want you to lecture at me. And we had flipped it to be like 70% saying, I like this format by the end of the semester.
Did you find the size of the class made any difference? Is it easier to do some of these activities if you have a smaller group?
They were all about the same, about 20, so we didn't get to change. But I think 15 to 20 is the best number. Because once you get down to like 4, then you're kind of, they have to work with the same people all the time. If you get somebody that's annoying, they don't like each other. Well, 30 is fine too.
Well, like in nursing, when you have them pair off or whatever, they typically all pair off, or do you assign them?
I assign them because
Definitely.
them is awful.
If you do that, if you have that many, probably you have to do activities where they can report back to you when you're in the front and less of you walking around. Because it's hard to get to more than 4 groups to talk about stuff.
When you have some people or groups that big, then I feel like I have to give each group something, a different activity.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
then that puts a lot of work trying to come up with those like 8 different activities, so you only have 5 people per group.
Oh, you can give them the same activity though, right?
You could.
I mean, depending on what kind of problem solving or
Right,
what you're having them do.
right. Because then I usually have them teach
Mm-hmm.
each other.
Yeah, it's like the jigsaw. That's cool too.
Our discipline is really important for the learner to teach.
Yeah.
You know, if they do other
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's why I feel that I would give them each something different, so they're not all teaching the exact same thing to each other. And getting bored because finally everybody's gonna be saying this exact same thing about something.
Right.
So I think that's my struggle, is coming up with 8 to 9 different pieces.
Well, you can do, if you do 2 things, you can have them work individually and then teach one person. So like this person's doing case study A, this is B, and you just make 20 pairs to teach each other that way. Or 4 things and then make your group of 4 after. All right, so what students think? So if you like survey them or ask them, they think lectures are the only way that makes sense because that's what they think it's supposed to be like. And sitting in a lecture is really easy, right? You don't have to do anything. You can take a 3-hour mental break if you want and think about football and your dating life, all that stuff. And then this is the biggest one that I think we run into. So they think, because especially a student who has maybe done well before in an easy class. If I come to class, I do what the teacher tells me, I highlight, I take notes, I read over my notes. I should get an A or a B. But if you notice, nothing in here actually says that they learned anything. And so to get them to kind of go beyond that and actually find out what they know and practice with it, it's definitely a challenge. And then the more the instructor covers, the more they learn, which is totally not true. Like that's how most of my teachers were in college, I think. You know, talk for 2 hours about physics, and I'm just sitting there, I've learned nothing these past 2 hours. I have no idea what you're talking about. And then this one's the biggest one. They get so upset if they don't get you telling them exactly what they need to write on their test at all times. There's not really an answer to that, except, you know, just reminding them like, you know, you are going to have to know this at some point, be able to explain it in your own words to a patient, or for any other, to tell another nurse what's going on. It's not just regurgitation of what the teacher said. That's not really learning. But any ideas for convincing them that any of those statements aren't right? Give them an app. I mean, I certainly tell them that when you're getting to your nursing classes, like, it's harder. You're going to need to actually really know how the heart works, not just you can say the left ventricle is here on a diagram. But All right, questions, ideas, comments? How much of this have y'all tried before? Some. I mean, I'll say I've tried all kinds of different amounts of it. So, you know, I kind of started just with read over the chapter. That didn't seem to do much. And then I went with more, oh, if you flip over the Bloom's level thing, this is actually how I use them. And this may be a little bit hard, but basically I give them a study guide for the chapter, and the stuff in bold is what they have to know when they come to class. And I try to make it easier ones like definitions. And then when I'm making my sort of lecture and activities, I try not to put those in there. Because if I'm asked them to do it at home, why tell them the answers again? And so then, you know, you could see those ones at the bottom. They're pretty hard, so it takes some activities and some time to distinguish which method of transport must be used by a cell. You give them concentrations inside, blah, blah, blah. And if I tried to teach everything on here in an hour and 20 minutes, there's no way I could get those harder things at the end. It seemed like the full flipped classroom thing without any lecture was maybe a little too much for intro students. I think that's why we didn't have better retention when it was just too much all at once. So maybe like, you know, half and half might be better. Half-hour lecture, half-hour activities, or whichever. So yeah, finish those up, try it out in a month or two, see how it works, and then we'll set up another time to meet again to move on from there.